Hello and welcome to another 2019 NFL Draft Scouting Report video from Pigskin Prodigies. I'm Dan Musso, and today we're going to be taking a look at Houston defensive tackle Ed Oliver, one of the potential early round picks in the upcoming draft. Going into the college football season, Ed Oliver was considered a potential number 1 overall pick, but as the season has run its course, I haven't seen him mocked at the number 1 overall slot nearly as often as I did before the season. So I just want to talk a little bit about why I think the hype is cool on Ed Oliver, but also why I think he should still be considered a top prospect in this draft class. So one of the first things that I think people criticize Ed Oliver for is his size, and I understand that criticism, but let me explain why I think he can still translate as an interior defensive lineman to the NFL even at his size. So Houston's athletics webpage lists him at 6'3", 292 pounds, but he's almost certainly going to measure a lot smaller than that. I think he's closer to 6'1" or 6'2", about 275, 280 at most. So if he did check in at the combine or the pro day at that size, that's smaller than like any full-time starting NFL interior defensive lineman. So I think people are rightfully concerned about that, but I still believe he can translate even at that size. Maybe needs to add a little weight if he checks in at like 275, but I think he can hold up at around 280 if that is indeed his size, because of the power that he has and the leverage that he plays with. So before Aaron Donald, we didn't really see defensive linemen at that size starting and succeeding in the NFL, but kind of seeing how Aaron Donald, I know Aaron Donald's a unicorn, but seeing how Aaron Donald is able to translate and perform against much bigger offensive linemen because of his power and his ability to play with leverage makes me more encouraged about Ed Oliver's chances of succeeding at the next level. Ed Oliver, even though he weighs 275 probably, he can hold up against double teams actually pretty well, and as a power rusher, he's completely overpowering. He has a super powerful upper body, and I'll get to talking about that a little bit more later on. But first I want to talk about his athleticism and his ball get off, which is the first thing I look for in defensive line prospects and edge rusher prospects. So as far as ball get off, Ed Oliver is phenomenal. He's as good as I've seen with his first step quickness and snap cone anticipation. His first step quickness is absolutely exceptional. He just flies off the snap. He gets into the backfield so quickly, and that puts a ton of pressure on interior offensive linemen and can really set up everything else that he wants to do with his pass rush plan once he develops that further, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And also his reaction to the snap is just amazing. He seems to almost know the snap count. It's crazy how quickly he reacts to the ball being snapped, and he's always the first defender seemingly to move after the ball is snapped. So snap count anticipation is great, and first step quickness is incredible, and that's just one of the first things that makes him potentially a very dangerous pass rusher at the next level. As far as run defense, Ed Oliver is very good. I would say right now he's clearly better as a run defender than a pass rusher, and I'll talk about his pass rush ability a little bit later on. But as far as run defense, he's very good. He has elite playmaking range for an interior defensive lineman. He can cover ground from sideline to sideline like a Mike linebacker, which is absolutely insane. He probably, like Aaron Donald, he might run in the 4.6s. That's entirely possible for Ed Oliver, and would not surprise me at all. It's just crazy how much ground he can cover sideline to sideline, and he can even chase running backs down or receivers sometimes if he's got an angle on him down the field. So yeah, really athletic, obviously. As far as one of the most important aspects of playing the run, he has good stack and shed ability, pretty consistent with getting off blocks versus the run, and that's one of the reasons he is such a good run defender. Also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, he holds up pretty well against double teams despite his size. Not quite as well as Quinnen Williams at holding up against double teams in my opinion, but still pretty good, especially considering his size. And that's one of the reasons I feel he can translate even at his size, is his strength and ability to hold up against double teams. Also sort of run defense, but also as like a pass rusher too, and like pass defender, I guess. He's a little bit inconsistent as a tackler. Misses some tackles in the backfield, even though his tackle for loss numbers are crazy. He had like 53 tackles for loss in 32 games in his career. So that could have been even better with better tackling, but maybe that might have something to do with shorter arms, and also I think not always coming to balance and breaking down, just like a fundamental thing with tackling. So that's a thing that could be cleaned up a little bit too. He's not a bad tackler though, but a little inconsistent, I would say. The biggest issue with Ed Oliver in run defense doesn't show up too often, but you do see it occasionally where bigger-bodied offensive linemen get underneath him and are able to control him, and sometimes like pancake him or drive him off the ball. Doesn't happen too often because he plays with leverage consistently and does a good job of getting his hands inside, but you do see it show up from time to time on film, and that's a little bit of a concern with his game, I would say. Alright, in terms of power, Ed Oliver is super strong, especially in the upper body. He generates a ton of knockback power with his bull rush and long arm, and can collapse pockets in a hurry. Really devastating as a power rusher. Also, he has pretty good lower body strength to anchor versus double teams in the run game. So, really powerful guy, really athletic guy, really has all the physical traits that you're looking for in an interior pass rusher at the next level. In terms of technique, I think Ed Oliver's technique against the run is very good. He plays with great natural leverage because he's a smaller guy, so I think that helps him out a lot. And his hand usage against the run is really good. Consistently gets his hands inside and always has good hand fits from what I've seen against the run. Because his arms are shorter, I think that can cause him to struggle at times to re-anchor when offensive linemen kind of get into his chest, and like I said earlier, that can lead to him getting pancaked or driven off the ball. But doesn't happen too often, but it does show up occasionally, so still would list it as a concern. Alright, here getting into pass rush technique. This is kind of, I think, everyone's biggest concern maybe with Ed Oliver, or certainly one of their biggest concerns, is that he lacks a consistent pass rush plan. I already talked about he's really good as like a power rusher with his bull rush and his long arm, but he doesn't always have a consistent counter to go to, so even if he does collapse the pocket with his bull rush, he isn't always able to free himself up from the blocker because he doesn't have a consistent counter move to go to. As far as pass rush moves, he does have a pretty good club rip move. That's kind of his go-to right now. Also has the bull rush and the long arm, but doesn't really have a consistent counter to go to. I've seen him flash a spin move as a counter, but he doesn't really have a consistent counter move to go to, so I think that really needs to work on adding counters to his game to make him realize his fullest potential and make him as dangerous pass rusher as he could possibly be. Also could use a little more variety, I think, with his initial pass rush moves to keep offensive linemen guessing, because while that club rip move does work sometimes, I think other times offensive linemen are able to see it coming, and they know that's one of his go-to moves. So if he added more moves to his repertoire, I think he'd be much more unpredictable and much harder to block if he can just keep offensive linemen guessing. Alright, in terms of recognition, Ed Oliver is good. I wouldn't say he's quite on the level of Quinnen Williams in that regard, but he's still good. He reads and reacts pretty quickly, generally finds the football, usually, pretty quickly. He's disciplined, he maintains his gap responsibilities, doesn't really freelance, knows when to squeeze gaps, is disciplined in his run fits, all of that stuff. As far as rushing the passer, he doesn't really over pursue when rushing up the field, so that's good. He doesn't get too much depth and pass the play by before he realizes what's going on. So pretty good awareness and recognition, I would say, for Ed Oliver. I already kind of talked about size and physical traits a little bit. Obviously undersized, teams will have concerns about that. Because of his size, I think he's not scheme versatile. I think he's strictly a 4-3 defensive lineman. Probably wouldn't want him in 3-man fronts unless you deploy some bear fronts and you've got a good nose tackle and then a couple 3 techniques. Then maybe You could use him in 3-man fronts, but for the most part, I think he's a 4-3 defensive tackle. You want him as a 1-gap defensive tackle. Like, using him as a 2-gap defensive tackle, I think would just be a complete waste of his talents and would be a great way to not get the most out of his skill set. So, don't think he should be used as a 2-gapper much, if at all. Also talked about arm length. I think that's a little bit of a concern because sometimes interior offensive linemen can outreach him, and that can cause him to struggle to disengage with blocks. So that's also a concern with his physical traits. As far as motor, that's one of the main things I look for in pass rushers, and Ed Oliver has as good a motor as I've seen in any like pass rushing position, really. As a pass rusher and a run defender, his motor is non-stop. He's extremely relentless. I've seen him chase plays 20 to 30 yards down the field, and yeah, just hustles super hard all of the time. I think his conditioning must be really good because he's able to play so hard all the time. So that's another thing that you like about Ed Oliver, is his motor and his ability to play a lot of snaps and play really hard all the time. As far as pursuit and closing speed, Ed Oliver is absolutely ridiculous with how quickly he can close on ball carries in the backfield and quarterbacks, and how quickly he can pursue plays as a run defender and make plays sideline to sideline. All of that is really outstanding. In terms of change of direction and agility, Ed Oliver is freaky for a defensive tackle. Like, again, as good as I've seen as far as agility for a defensive tackle. Just ridiculous how quickly and smoothly he can change directions for someone that's his size. In terms of flexibility, Ed Oliver has really good hip, ankle, and shoulder flexion. He can corner on linemen at tight angles. It's really impressive to see him dip and rip under linemen and just flatten his path to the quarterback at angles that most defensive tackles couldn't even dream of. Lastly, as far as red flags, I mentioned size, so I won't talk about that anymore, but there are a few others to note with Ed Oliver as well. One is the level of competition. He played in the American Athletic Conference, so wasn't consistently going up against top competition, so people will rightfully have concerns about that. Also, he had a sideline altercation with his coach, Major Applewhite, where they got into an argument about him wearing a jacket that was supposed to be reserved for active players. So I'm not really concerned about that, but it was a thing that happened, so I'm gonna list it on here. And then he also missed 4 games this year due to knee injury, so a little bit of a durability concern there, but nothing too major. To summarize my thoughts on Ed Oliver, as far as a grade, I have a top 10 grade on him. I know he hasn't reached his potential as a pass rusher yet, but I think he's just scratching the surface, and with NFL coaching, I think he could eventually become great in that area. In college, he didn't have the greatest sack numbers, I will admit, or pressure numbers, but I think a lot of that can be attributed to 2 things. One, the positions he was asked to play, often playing nose tackle, is one reason his sack numbers weren't higher, and also because he played at Houston, he was the only real threat Houston had on the defensive line, so he would get double and triple teamed a ton, especially double teamed, got double teamed a ton, and occasionally even triple teamed. So I think that's another reason for his lack of sack production. Also his lack of technical refinement as a pass rusher as well. So if you get more talent around him, and if you develop his pass rush moves, I think he can unlock his full potential as a pass rusher, and I think he has a lot of potential as a pass rusher if he's able to do that, because he is so athletic. He has such great burst, bend, and agility that he could eventually become a really great pass rusher. Okay, I already talked about scheme fit, so now I'll talk about NFL comparison. From a size, athleticism, and power standpoint, I don't really think there's any other comparison than Aaron Donald for Ed Oliver, but I would compare him to a poor man's Aaron Donald because I scouted Aaron Donald at Pittsburgh, and he's not nearly as good as a pass rusher as Donald was coming out of college even. either from a productivity or technique standpoint. So definitely not as good as Aaron Donald was as a prospect. Certainly not as good as he is now. But has that type of physical talent like an Aaron Donald, crazily enough, if you watch the film. So yeah, I compare him to a poor man's Aaron Donald and think his ceiling maybe could even approach Aaron Donald, as ridiculous as that may sound. If you watch the film, you can see the traits that are comparable to Aaron Donald, although obviously he's not nearly as refined as Aaron Donald was as a prospect, or certainly as an NFL player. That's all I have for this scouting breakdown. I hope you'll join me in the weeks and months leading up to the draft as I break down more NFL prospects, and thanks again for your continued support.